As the Roman Empire entered the 3rd century AD, the golden age of Roman emperors found itself on the cusp of a disappointing end. During the 3rd century, Rome suffered from near constant conflict and was ruled by a total of 22 emperors. The Roman Empire of late antiquity was divided with an uncertain future, when, in 284 AD, Diocletian would take his place as emperor and temporarily restore peace and prosperity to Rome, but at a heavy cost to Rome's unity. Diocletian divided power into the Tetrarchy, the rule of 4, with himself and General Galerius ruling the east, while Maximian and his General Constantius ruled the west. After the inevitable power struggles that ensued, Constantine, son of Constantius, emerged as sole emperor of a reunified Rome in 324 AD. He moved the Roman capital to Byzantium and renamed it as Constantinople. Just 1 year later, in 325, Constantine made Christianity Rome's official religion at the Council of Nicaea. Roman unity under Constantine would prove to be short-lived, and only 30 years after his death, the Eastern and Western empires would once again be divided. The Eastern Roman Empire would later become known as the Byzantine Empire, and would remain largely intact for centuries to come. The Western Roman Empire would continue to be racked with internal conflicts and threats from abroad until it would finally fall by the 5th century, bringing an end to over 1,000 years of rule as the greatest empire in human history. Civilization would endure another 200 years of struggles, however, through the 5th and 6th centuries, as it slowly and painfully makes the transition into a new era known as the Middle Ages. Within 2 centuries after its fall, around 486 AD, Europe had become a very different place from what it once was under Roman rule. By almost every standard, Western civilization had relapsed severely. Trade and the economy had collapsed, and the populace was mired in dismal squalor. Unable to travel or attend school, education and literacy had become relics of the past. As a result, people could not see their situation from a larger perspective, and a basic siege mentality gripped their world. The much maligned barbarians in later antiquity had compelled the Romans to let more and more foreigners inside their state. Since most spoke a language based on common Germanic, the Romans referred to them collectively as Germans, even though they actually represented a wide array of nations and cultures. These newly adopted resident aliens were assigned to work farms or were conscripted into the Roman army in numbers so large that the late Latin word for soldier came to be barbarus. Where these barbarians met resistance, they sneaked or pushed their way inside the empire in such a profusion that Rome was quickly becoming a nation of immigrants. Things had actually been that way for centuries. Only by late antiquity, it was undeniable that in spite of being called Roman, the empire was, in fact, a multicultural society. Barbarians were, and had been for a long time, guarding and feeding the empire, which made it all the more difficult to claim that they shouldn't also be running it. While 3 centuries earlier, the Roman satirist Juvenal had lamented, "I can't stand a Greek Rome." Now, Rome wasn't just Greek. It was Dacian, Egyptian, Syrian, and most of all, even more German by the day. Traveling all the way from Mongolia, the Huns had begun encroaching on Europe sometime after 350 AD. Toughened by crossing the Russian steppes on small ponies, these Asiatic nomads spread terror far and wide, developing a reputation for insurmountable ferocity. The Goths, a loose confederation of Germanic peoples living northeast of the Balkan Mountains, were the first to feel the sting of the Huns' assault from Asia. The Goths were hit so hard and quickly by the Huns that they were split into the Ostrogoths and the Visigoths. By 376 AD, the Ostrogoths had fallen completely into Hunnic hands, where they would be victimized and enslaved for nearly a century. The Visigoths desperately sought protection by appealing to Rome for asylum. There, they ran up against a shield of custom stations at the Roman border. Facing a surge of frantic immigrants, the Roman Emperor Valens had little choice but to relent and let them in. As newcomers to Roman civilization, they were ill-equipped to live in a state run on taxes and mired in a complex language of legalities, and thus made easy prey for unscrupulous, greedy imperial bureaucrats who took every opportunity to cheat and abuse them. Very quickly, the Visigoths found themselves bound in something heavier and even more constricting than chains: the coils of red tape. And they responded as any reasonable barbarian would. They demanded fair treatment, and when their pleas went unheard, they embarked upon a rampage. Valens called out his army to intimidate the Visigoths into returning to their designated territory and tithe, but the barbarians remained disobedient. Left with no other recourse, Valens engaged the Visigoths at the Battle of Adrianople in northeastern Greece. The Visigoths defeated and massacred the Roman legions, and Valens himself was killed in the course of the conflict. His successor, Theodosius I, resorted to a standard Roman policy and pacified the Visigoths with handouts and promises, but money and titles couldn't buy back a Roman army or a reputation for invincibility. Theodosius managed to hold the state together and keep up a tense facade of peace until he died prematurely in 395. His young, pampered, feeble-minded sons were suddenly thrust to the forefront of Roman politics, yet another disaster for the Romans at that juncture in history. Those children, Arcadius and Honorius, who were both still in their teens, were ill-prepared to hold real power. When a strong new leader named Alaric rose to power among the Visigoths and started advancing on the west, Honorius panicked and recalled the Roman legions stationed on the Rhine River, which opened the door for other barbarians to force their way into the empire. After the assassination of Roman general Stilicho in 408, Alaric and his forces invaded Italy with brutal barbarian dispatch and headed straight for the city of Rome itself. Honorius abandoned the capital, evading the Visigoths by fleeing to another Roman city, Ravenna, where he watched and waited from a safe distance. In the infamous Visigoth sack of Rome in 410 AD, Alaric and his comrades plundered the city for 3 days, a wound which went deep into the heart of an already ailing Roman state. Alaric died only a few months after leading his forces on Rome, leaving the Visigoths without competent leadership and, more importantly, still in search of a land they could call home. After some negotiations, the remnants of their army and people moved out of Italy to southwestern Gaul and later Spain, where, with the help of the Roman army, they displaced the Vandals and established a kingdom that would endure for nearly 2 centuries. All this time, the Huns were enslaving Eastern Europe, inflicting their own brand of terror on the barbarian tribes there. When the Huns' new powerful European-born leader, Attila, learned that the Christians in Rome had pronounced him the scourge of the gods, he was very pleased. Sweeping west across the Rhine River into Gaul, Attila's forces met a Roman army near Chalons in central Gaul in 451 AD, and, against all odds, Attila was defeated. Infuriated, he took the loss as an insult and wheeled south, heading for Italy. The Romans, in panic, fled at his approach. But the leader of the church, Pope Leo I, not only stood his ground, but went to face down Attila in person. In 452 AD, they actually did meet and speak, but only in private. In the wake of their discussion, Attila wheeled about yet again, this time leaving Italy never to return. Shortly thereafter, Attila died of uncertain causes. The Hunnic army had contracted some type of epidemic during their brief stay on the Italian peninsula. This mysterious disease decimated their ranks, and soon after their departure, they disappeared completely from Europe and history. Following their expulsion from Spain by the Visigoths and the Romans, the Vandals fled to the northwest corner of Africa, modern-day Morocco. Once there, their wily and double-dealing leader Gaiseric helped them expand their domain by uprooting Roman control over the rich provinces of North Africa. The Vandals' imminent approach on Carthage, modern-day Tunisia, in 430 AD. Next, moving to sea, the Vandals took up piracy and severely disrupted trade in the western Mediterranean. The recent assassination of Aetius, who was the most competent Roman general of the day, only made the Vandals' path to naval power and domination easier. This horrifying replay of Stilicho's death opened the way for the devastating Vandal sack of Rome in 455 AD. The Vandals' attack involved prolonged physical ruin, a destruction so complete and indiscriminate and emblematic of wanton atrocity that these barbarians' very name made its way into common parlance, and ultimately English, as vandalism, meaning the malicious destruction of property. The final days of the Roman Empire are generally agreed to be in the year 476 AD, when the German general Odoacer deposed the last Roman emperor, a boy ironically named Romulus Augustulus. He removed the child from the throne and sent him off to a monastery, where he subsequently died. The usurper faced no real opposition. The reality was that barbarian leaders like him had been the power behind the throne for many years in Rome, and the German strongman did little more than end the pretense of non-barbarian control of the Roman West. Despite the travails of their Western counterparts, the Eastern emperors in Constantinople continued to demand that the entire empire pay taxes into a common treasury. From there, few of these funds ever made their way back to the West, where they were desperately needed to defend the state and rebuild its infrastructure. In open defiance of this tradition, Odoacer began keeping the monies he collected from those areas he governed. The emperors of the East were incensed to find their outstretched hands empty and responded in a manner consistent with standard Roman policy of the day. They hired barbarians to do their dirty work. In 493, Theodoric, the leader of the Ostrogoths, who had at last been liberated from Hunnic dominion, was commissioned to head west and dispatch Odoacer, which he did in typically savage fashion. In the course of negotiating peace with his barbarian brother at a banquet, Theodoric stabbed him to death. But once he'd had a good look at the desperate condition of things in the West, Theodoric refused to hand Italy over to some far-off Roman emperor who had no intention of actually ruling it, but only milking it for taxes. Now the lord of the land, Theodoric set about restoring what more than a century of neglect, civil war, invasion, and vandalism had wrought. Roman Italy needed a caring hand like his, and this barbarian proved the last ruler in antiquity to lend it such. To this day, however, his strained relations with his secretary, Boethius, an Orthodox Christian, dominate the accounts of his regime. Theodoric ultimately had Boethius executed, but the Ostrogothic king would be better remembered for building a sound and effective government centered in Ravenna, on the coast of the Adriatic Sea, where his tomb can still be seen today. After 550, it is possible to begin to speak of a medieval Byzantine rather than an ancient East Roman Empire. 4 traumas would eventually transform the one into the other, namely pestilence, warfare, social upheaval, and the Arab-Muslim assault of the 630s. Justinian is but one example of the civilizing magic that Constantinople often worked upon the heirs of those who ventured within its walls. Justin, the uncle, was a rude and illiterate soldier. Justinian, the nephew, on the other hand, was a cultivated gentleman, adept at theology, a mighty builder of churches, and a sponsor of the codification of Roman law. All those accomplishments are, in the deepest sense of the word, civilian, and yet Justinian's empire was almost constantly at war during his reign. From Lazica to the Arabian desert and the Persian frontier, the strength of the East Roman armies was evident in the fact that while containing Persian might, Justinian could still send troops to attack the Huns in Crimea and to maintain the Danubian frontier against a host of enemies. In 532, Justinian decided to abandon military operations in favor of diplomacy. At the cost of considerable tribute, he negotiated an endless peace with the Persian king, which freed the Romans' hands for operations elsewhere. Justinian succeeded in attaining the first of the objectives needed for reconquest in the West: peace in the East. After 532, Justinian ruled more firmly than ever before. With the proclamation of the endless peace, he could hope to use his earlier won reputation as a champion for Chalcedonian orthodoxy and appeal to those Western Romans who preferred the rule of a Catholic Roman emperor to that of an Arian German kinglet. In those early years of the 530s, Justinian could indeed pose as a pattern of a Roman and Christian emperor. Latin was his language, and his knowledge of Roman history and antiquities was profound. Throughout the 530s, Justinian's generals almost constantly had to fight to preserve imperial authority in the new province of North Africa and in the Balkans as well. During the 550s, Justinian's armies were to prove equal to the challenge, but a major disaster prevented them from doing so between 541 and about 548. The disaster was the bubonic plague, and it would eventually transform Eastern Rome into the medieval Byzantine Empire. The plague was first noted in Egypt, and from there it passed through Syria and Asia Minor to Constantinople. By 543, it had reached Italy and Africa, and it may also have attacked the Persian armies on campaign in that year. In East Asia, the disease persisted into the 20th century. Comparative studies based upon statistics derived from an incidence of the same disease in late medieval Europe suggests that between 1/3 and 1/2 of the population of Constantinople may well have died, while the lesser cities of the empire and the countryside were by no means immune. The East Roman or Byzantine state of the late 6th century seemed to confront many of the same threats that had destroyed the Western Empire in the 5th century. Barbarians pressed upon it from beyond the Balkan frontier, and peoples of barbarian origin manned the armies defending it. Wealth accumulated during the 5th century had been expended, and to satisfy the basic economic and military needs of state and society, there were too few native Romans. If the Byzantine Empire avoided the fate of Western Rome, it did so only because it was to combine valor and good luck with certain advantages of institutions, emotions, and attitudes that the older empire had failed to enjoy, such as diplomatic skill, which blends institutional and attitudinal change, which would never have succeeded had not the Byzantine statesmen been far more curious and knowing than Justinian's 5th century predecessor about the habits, customs, and movements of the barbarian peoples. The Byzantines' attitude had changed in yet another way. He was willing to accept the barbarian within his society, provided that the latter, in his turn, accepted Chalcedonian Christianity and the emperor's authority. The simple reality of Rome in late antiquity is that something big and centralized in the West broke up into several smaller units, each resembling in many ways the larger whole to which they had once belonged. But the image of Rome has lived on. Indeed, the majority of Western languages, laws, religions, customs, and cultures are in some way fundamentally Roman, making all of us, by all fair standards, modern Romans. And until the last traces of Roman civilization are erased and forgotten, Rome cannot be said to have died or fallen. But one thing is certain. What was once a great and mighty empire for centuries is no more, and civilization will face many struggles and hardships as they move into the Middle Ages and a new Europe on their journey through the pain of progress. Thank you for watching.